Victory gardens sprouted on 20 million American lawns and vacant lots, encouraged by posters depicting patriotic families cultivating vegetables. Grow your own and plant a victory garden campaigns reframed agricultural labor as civic participation, allowing even those unable to serve militarily or work in factories to contribute meaningfully. The propaganda machine's effectiveness raised uncomfortable questions about manipulation and truth that echoed long after the war's end. Elmer Davis and his Office of War Information staff grappled constantly with the tension between maintaining public morale and maintaining public trust. Outright fabrication might produce short-term results, but risked long-term credibility. The solution was selective emphasis, strategic omission, and careful framing rather than complete invention. Contemporary journalism ethics were notably less rigorous than modern standards, yet even by 1940s measures, some propaganda crossed troubling lines. The government systematically suppressed photographs of dead American servicemen until September 1943, when Life magazine published George Strock's image of 3 dead soldiers on Buena Beach. The Office of Censorship had concluded that earlier publication might demoralize the public, but by mid-1943, officials worried that prolonged sanitization was breeding complacency. The carefully timed release of disturbing images was itself propaganda, calibrated to produce optimal psychological effect. Japanese internment camps never appeared in wartime propaganda posters, despite affecting over 120,000 people. The forced relocation of American citizens, based solely on ancestry, represented democracy's failure, an inconvenient truth that contradicted the Four Freedoms narrative. Instead, posters warned against enemy aliens in vague terms, while avoiding specific reference to the concentration camps operating in California, Arizona, Wyoming, and other states. The Soviet Union's portrayal underwent dramatic transformation as political necessity dictated. Before June 22, 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, American propaganda had depicted the Soviet Union as nearly as threatening as Nazi Germany, 2 totalitarian powers that had carved up Poland between them. After Hitler's invasion forced Stalin into the Allied camp, propaganda executed a swift about-face. Suddenly, posters celebrated the brave Soviet people resisting fascist aggression. Uncle Sam shook hands with a resolute Russian soldier. American workers were urged to increase production to supply their Soviet allies. The ideological differences that had seemed insurmountable weeks earlier evaporated in propaganda's pragmatic embrace. Several artists and writers employed by the Office of War Information resigned over these contradictions. E.B. White, celebrated essayist, left after concluding that some campaigns sacrificed truthfulness for expedience. Documentary photographer Dorothea Lange, hired to photograph Japanese internment, found her images immediately suppressed by the government and impounded for decades, because they humanized internees rather than justifying their imprisonment. The British propaganda relationship proved particularly complex. American posters drew heavily from British designs and concepts, yet the two nations' messaging sometimes conflicted. British propaganda emphasized stoic endurance under bombardment, keep calm, and carry on being the most famous, though it was never actually distributed during the war. American propaganda stressed aggressive optimism, an inevitable victory, a tone that sometimes struck British audiences, enduring their 4th or 5th year of war, as naive. The fine line between boosting morale and creating dangerous overconfidence became apparent in Pacific Theater posters that depicted Japanese soldiers as incompetent, cowardly, or technologically inferior. These caricatures bore no resemblance to the skilled, determined enemy that American Marines encountered on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Some military commanders complained that propaganda had left troops unprepared for the reality of facing well-trained, fanatic defenders who would fight to the death rather than surrender. When the war ended in 1945, the propaganda apparatus was not dismantled but transformed. The psychological warfare techniques, visual strategies, and mass persuasion methods developed during the conflict found new applications in the emerging Cold War. The Office of War Information was formally dissolved in August 1945, but its personnel and methodologies migrated to other agencies, the State Department's information programs, the newly created Central Intelligence Agencies, Covert Operations, and the United States Information Agency established in 1953. The advertising industry absorbed many propaganda veterans who recognized that selling war bonds differed little from selling soap. Both required understanding human psychology, crafting compelling narratives, and creating emotional connections to abstract concepts. Rosa Reeves, who would pioneer aggressive television advertising, had worked on war bond campaigns. David Ogilvy, future advertising legend, had analyzed propaganda effectiveness for British intelligence. The techniques that mobilized nations for total war now mobilize consumers for total commerce. Poster art itself declined as television emerged as the dominant mass medium. By the 1950s, the visual language of wartime propaganda seemed quaint, a relic of an analog age, yet that language persisted in subtler forms. Political campaigns adopted the same psychological triggers, the same enemy construction, the same aspirational imagery that had sold war to the American public. The techniques merely migrated to new platforms. The rediscovery of World War II propaganda posters beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s occurred as the war generation reached retirement and sought to memorialize their experiences. Rosie the Riveter, barely remembered for decades, was resurrected as a feminist symbol during the women's liberation movement. The irony was rich. A corporate poster designed to temporarily recruit women into factory work before returning them to domestic roles became an icon of permanent female economic empowerment. The reinterpretation illustrated how propaganda's meaning evolves beyond creators' intentions. Contemporary scholarship on World War II propaganda has grown increasingly sophisticated in examining not just the poster's content, but their troubling implications. The dehumanization of Japanese enemies is now recognized as having facilitated both wartime atrocities and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. When an enemy has been reduced to vermin in the public imagination, their mass destruction becomes not merely militarily justifiable, but morally satisfying. Yet the propaganda prepared Americans psychologically for weapons that would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians in atomic fire. The racial and ethnic stereotypes embedded in wartime posters did not disappear when peace arrived. They reinforced existing prejudices and created new ones that persisted for generations. Japanese Americans faced discrimination long after the war's end, partly because propaganda had so effectively portrayed them as perpetual foreigners. Inherently suspicious and untrustworthy, the poster's visual legacy outlasted their immediate political purpose. Yet these same propaganda posters also capture something authentic about the home front, experience the genuine sense of collective purpose, shared sacrifice, and social mobilization that characterized the war years. For all their manipulation and exaggeration, they document a moment when American society, however imperfectly, oriented itself toward a common goal. The poster's power derived partly from reflecting real emotions and beliefs, not merely manufacturing them. Museum exhibitions of wartime propaganda now appear regularly, always accompanied by careful contextual framing that acknowledges both the artistry and the ethical problems. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans maintains an extensive collection, as does the Library of Congress and the Imperial War Museum in London. These institutions struggle with presenting propaganda as both historical artifact and cautionary tale, impressive in its effectiveness, disturbing in its methods, and instructive in revealing how easily public opinion can be shaped when governments control information and exploit fear. The digital age has not rendered World War II propaganda obsolete, but rather more relevant. The same psychological principles that made posters effective operate with multiplied force in social media, where targeting is precise, distribution is instant, and fact-checking is minimal. Foreign governments and domestic political actors employ sophisticated propaganda that would impress Elmer Davis and his Office of War Information staff. The tools have evolved from printing presses to algorithms, but human psychology remains largely unchanged. Contemporary propagandists studying World War II campaigns recognize several enduring lessons. First, visual imagery bypasses rational analysis and triggers emotional response more effectively than text. Second, repetition normalizes even extreme messages. Third, enemy dehumanization facilitates violence while self-mythologizing justifies sacrifice. Fourth, The most effective propaganda contains enough truth to be credible while omitting inconvenient contradictions. Fifth, people want to believe narratives that assign them heroic roles in cosmic struggles. The question that haunts any examination of World War II propaganda is whether its effectiveness justified its methods. The Allied cause was genuinely righteous in ways that subsequent conflicts would not be. Defeating Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy represented a clear moral imperative. If propaganda accelerated that victory and saved lives, can we condemn the manipulation it required? Yet accepting this logic creates dangerous precedent. Noble ends justify manipulative means in obviously just wars. How much easier to justify manipulation in ambiguous conflicts, where righteousness is less clear. The posters themselves, now collector's items and museum pieces, remain visually striking decades after their creation. Their bold colors, simple compositions, and clear messages demonstrate design principles that transcend their propaganda purpose. They represent a distinctive artistic moment when modernist aesthetics served governmental aims. When commercial art techniques were weaponized for war, and when millions of Americans encountered sophisticated visual persuasion in their daily lives, perhaps the most unsettling legacy is how thoroughly the propaganda succeeded. Generations later, Americans still envision World War II largely through the lens these posters created: a unified home front. Noble sacrifice, clear enemies, and ultimate triumph. The reality was more complex, marked by racism, profiteering, labor conflicts, and moral compromises. But the propaganda's simplified narrative proved more emotionally satisfying, and thus more durable than complicated truth. In shaping how Americans remember the war, the posters achieved a propaganda victory that outlasted the military one, constructing a usable past that continues shaping national identity. The crazy World War II propaganda posters were never really crazy at all. They were calculated, sophisticated, and devastatingly effective instruments of mass persuasion that helped win a necessary war, while establishing techniques of manipulation that would outlast the conflict itself. They remind us that, even in just causes, truth becomes the first casualty, and that the images we create to motivate action today will shape the memories we inherit tomorrow. The woman in the polka dot bandana flexing her bicep will endure not because of what she originally meant, but because each generation reimagines her meaning, and which is, perhaps, propaganda's final, most enduring trick.